It's Tuesday, June 30th, 2020, the last day of the the first half of the year 2020. Very eventful first half of the year, globally, Africa-wise, and in Nigeria. And today on the Economy and Politics show, we'll be discussing the recent International Monetary Fund revised growth projections across the globe and for Nigeria. With me to lead this conversation is Dr. Andrew Nevin, a Canadian citizen based in Nigeria and Chief Economist of WaterHouse Coopers, West Africa. Nice to have you on the show, Dr. Nevin.
Great to be here. Good morning.
Good morning. First, let's begin with how the experience has been for you first half of the year, particularly shaped by the COVID-19 pandemic.
Well, I think it's been very difficult for everyone. We came into the year optimistic. I think in Nigeria, oil price was a little bit up. That helps us. The global economy was moving well. I think people were very slow to pick up on, from a medical viewpoint, but for this show, more importantly, from an economic viewpoint of what the impact was going to be of COVID-19. But I mean, when you start to lock down country after country, and of course we've had it through Nigeria, you get the economic impact on that. So it's very difficult. Certainly in my lifetime, we might count the second quarter. We're just wrapping up today as the most difficult human and economic quarter in my lifetime.
Very, very, very impactful. And the International Monetary Fund has made several projections, and then they've revised their global growth and the growth for Nigeria and other parts of the globe. Let's first begin with the global growth projections of minus 4.9% for 2020. How would this impact global economy and, of course, emerging economies, including Sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, this is unprecedented. I mean, people, I think listening to the show, of course, understand. I mean, a normal growth rate for the global economy is somewhere between 3 to 4%. And it's been powered in the last number of years by China, increasing by India. But many other countries around the world, our neighbors, Ghana, have been growing quickly, for example, Ethiopia in Africa. So 3 to 4% is normal. And I'm not sure, I can't even remember in 2009 when we had the great financial crisis, whether global growth actually went negative or essentially just went to zero. So this is an extraordinary event to have global growth projected at minus 5%. So GDP shrinkage of 5% is just a catastrophic outcome. And of course, we've seen in the second quarter numbers. I mean, in Europe, the number generally seems to be about a decline of 8% for 2020. I mean, 25%, if I recall right, is the projection for the UK for the quarter, the quarter-over-quarter drop. So these are extraordinary numbers. They're having impacts on every person on the planet in an economic sense. And when the incomes, one thing I think that we've all learned from this is that one person's spending is another person's income. So when you lock down and you stop spending because you're no longer flying, you're no longer taking Uber, you're no longer going out to restaurants, you're no longer even just taking your car and putting a foil in it to be able to get to work. All of that spending is someone else's income, so their incomes collapse. So we're seeing the greatest economic impact that we've ever seen in our lifetime. So we're supposed to grow 3 to 4%, and we're going to shrink about 5%, which means on a per capita basis, it's almost a 10% difference in 2020 versus 2019.
Well, as an economist, what has been the learning point when you look at the global stimulus? I mean, it's over $11 trillion pumped in from the US to the UK, even to Canada, your country of origin. And,
no, absolutely. Yeah, so I think, of course, I mean, governments, including Nigeria to the extent that it could, and we'll come back to that. But I mean, yes. Governments recognize this issue in the second quarter. They rolled out all sorts of programs to make sure people were kept as whole as they could in the circumstances. Obviously, it was not an individual's fault, the COVID-19 crisis. And so you had stimulus packages that range from 10 to 25% of GDP, which again is extraordinary, right? Yes. The only problem with this is that it was predicated, I think, at the time that we would have a recovery or a sharp recovery. And I think what we're learning with COVID-19 is that the long-lasting economic damage is just beginning. So of course, I mean, it's got us through the second quarter, but at the expense of greatly increased budget deficits in the UK and Canada and Australia and the United States, certainly Germany. And the governments won't have that capacity to keep spending at that rate every quarter, and yet we're not seeing the economy rebound back yet. So I think we're just the beginning of we might be getting to the end of the short-term economic pain, but I think what is starting to become clear a little bit is that there's going to be long-term economic consequences through 2021, 2022. I was reading about one industry that says we're going to lose an entire decade effectively this. And obviously the airlines are facing catastrophic losses for years. So we're just starting into the economic impact of this as we enter the third quarter of 2020.
Yeah, I mean that is something that will continue to need a coordination between fiscal and monetary policies globally, and we'll continue to monitor that. But let's go to Nigeria, where you are based and you're involved in several capacities, supporting development and planning from tech to the economic policy range. And when you look at the IMF revised growth for Nigeria, it's minus 5.4%. When you looked at it, did it come as a surprise? And what are your thoughts around that revised growth for Nigeria?
Well, I mean, this is very difficult, I think, for all of us in Nigeria. So we said very early on in this, at the beginning of March, we said the number one objective for the federal government was to make sure that two things happened. One was that we got resources into the hands of the bottom of the pyramid, because as we went into lockdown, day laborers, of course, lose their daily wage. They don't have savings to fall back on, and people need to eat. The second thing we said at that time was that you needed to keep the food supply chain moving, because, of course, there was no point in giving people resources or palliatives if there wasn't a food supply. And I think overall, Nigeria has done a pretty good job of that. And not, of course, I think it's taken more than the federal government. It's taken the federal government, state governments, individuals, organized private sector, NGOs, churches, mosques, civil society, all working together to do the best that we can in the circumstances. That said, I think, like globally, we're entering the second phase. Of course, the lockdown. I think the interstate lockdown, His Excellency President Buhari is going to take off, reduce tomorrow. So we're having more activity, but the economy is still not in any kind of shape to bounce back. And the fiscal stimulus that Nigeria's had, so we were talking about 10 to 25% of GDP for some developed countries. The fiscal stimulus, if we measure properly in Nigeria, is about 1 to 2% of GDP. So it's not zero, but people have made an effort. But we have limited capacity in Nigeria for this kind of stimulus on that. So I think we're in for some very challenging economic times in the next few months and few years.
Yeah, Doctor, I mean, interesting times. We grew at 1.87%. Few people got that projection a bit right. Some said 1%, others said we're expecting negative growth. But let's look at the race for liquidity. I mean, this brings to the fore the global race for liquidity, and Nigeria cannot be left out. How can Nigeria reposition itself? One of the thoughts of several economists is for us to look at our assets. We have about $900 billion assets, idle assets that we can really look at making viable. That's the ProShare Nigeria Economics report brought that out, that we can really leverage on those assets and build liquidity. Do you agree with that? And are there other avenues Nigeria can leverage, because this is a time for liquidity?
Well, I think for many commentators over the last few years have said there need to be some fundamental changes in the economy. I mean, we had a recession in 2016. The economy shrank 1.6%. And this is all against the background, of course, that population is growing almost 3%. So when we shrink at 1.6%, then the GDP per capita reduces by 4%, which means much higher unemployment, much higher poverty throughout the country. And then when we moved on to growth in 2017, 2018, 2019, the growth was still below GDP. Below population growth. So in effect, per capita, we're getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And when we get the sort of numbers that IMF is talking about this year and our population growth, again, a catastrophic impact on incomes, on employment, and on poverty in the country. So how do we get out of it? And I think the report you've mentioned, and we, of course, at PwC put out our report on dead capital last year as well, are one of the, maybe the first thing at the top of the list. How do we catalyze, or how do we unlock all this dead capital that we have? So it's in real estate, it's in other assets that are not being used productively. And I think we've come to the point where the economy is in such difficult position. I hope the term we've been using, in a sense, is a forced restructuring. There's going to be no choice but to take action to unlock. There is capital in the world, and Nigeria needs, and a lot of that capital is resident in Nigeria, so we don't need outsiders to invest it. It's right there, particularly in the real estate sector. We just need the policies that would unlock it. And of course, we also have state-owned assets that are unproductive. So Agiacosa Steel comes to mind, the refineries at the NNPC, for example. They need to become unlocked and productive. And I think in most cases it's probably going to be being put in private hands. So there is a path out. But I think the number one message we're trying to give right now is that there is an urgency to this. I mean, when we have the anemic recovery of the last few years, so already a lot of pressure, and then now we put on a per capita income reduction of probably 7 to 10% this year, based on the IMF numbers, when we factor in the population growth. We are in a dire economic situation, and it takes some bold action.
Really bold action. And we would like to really see that bold action happen in the country. But when we talk about the bold action, we've seen the economic sustainability plan, like you earlier mentioned. It's been approved by the Federal Executive Council with a 2.3 trillion naira stimulus. When you look at the variations of it, the policy trust, looking at mass agriculture, mass housing, leveraging solar and renewable energy, leveraging your space, the space you always have interest in, digital economy. When you look at that ESP, what, in your analysis, can it really bring at this point in terms of putting Nigeria on that pedestal to recovery, considering the fact that, yes, we're in dire straits?
Well, I think the ESP suffers from really the same flaws that the ERGP suffers from, right? In a sense, so if you read the ERGP and
the
Economic Recovery and Growth Plan, so then I've read the whole thing. I mean, each individual program sounds like it makes sense, but the totality of the complexity, program after program after program, run at a national level, and then, I mean, if you run a business in Nigeria, and you were asked the question, how long would it take to build a business out at national scale? You would probably say somewhere between 5 and 15 years. Like, even if you have so if you're trying to build an organization that's national,
very long.
it's very not a simple thing. So just announcing a program that's going to reach every state is not necessarily going to. I think we have evidence that it has not worked in Nigeria. So these announcements, I think that the federal government is exactly right on the sectors, right? So the agriculture, the solar, etc. But where they've got it wrong, I think, is again and we are like many other commentators, too much centralization. The only way really to move forward is at a state level that they sort out how to unlock the dead capital, because we're not going to sort out this problem from Abuja for Cross River. We're not going to sort it out from Abuja for Sokoto. We're not going to sort it out for Katsina from Abuja. So I think that the objectives are right, but we're in danger of just having, again, more programs, new secretariats, new MDAs. I mean, I think some of the most interesting things that have happened in this economic crisis, though, people have not been talking about, is it is forcing an economic restructuring of Nigeria. I mean, we're moving from 2 trillion deficit to at least 5 trillion, probably 6 trillion naira deficit. There's enormous fiscal pressure. I mean, the projection from the federal government right now is that the revenue from oil will decline from 5.5 trillion to 1.1 trillion. So what's the impact, for example, on the federal allocation at the state and local level? I mean, at the end of like today, right now, and certainly next month, you're really going to start to see, I think, issues around states being able to pay for their payroll, for example. And as we enter into this next phase of the economic impact of COVID-19, I think, again, we're going to be in a case where this restructuring is forced. So if you look at one of the things that's very interesting, for example, that's happened, we've talked about it for years, but we've effectively had the foil subsidy removed, right? There's still some issues going on, but basically the federal government said it's being removed. we've effectively had we've had a devaluation and a narrowing between the I&E window and the official rate, and we had the government come out. The federal government was very clear last week that we're moving to a single unified exchange rate. So we're not going to have parallel rate, I&E rate, official rate. They're all going to come together. That is an extraordinary change on that. We've had the President Buhari, His Excellency, come out and endorse the Orange report. So this is the report written in 2013 to consolidate and streamline the MDA. So why is he coming out? So Her Excellency Minister Ahmed, took it forward to him. I think maybe beginning of April, he assented to it. Why is the government doing this at this time? Because of the fiscal situation. In a sense, all of this is being forced. So between the decisions already made and the fiscal situation, I think we're going to see more forced restructuring. And we, as I said, believe that part of this has to be that the states have to be responsible for their own economic development. And I think very quickly we're going to be in that situation. So if you go back to the recovery plan that the Vice President has led, while it focuses on the right issues, I actually don't think that's going to be the structure that we get out of this. But if we unlock the dead capital, we send some positive signals to Nigerians, the diaspora, and other investors outside. We are going to get investment, but we're not going to necessarily see it in 2020. We may start to see it in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you very well on the need for fiscal restructuring. And for states also, PwC's research team, our economics report has assessed several states from the South-South for all the 6 geopolitical zones. And the key things there are showing that there must be diversification of revenue. There must be also the need to invest in critical sectors like agro, digital technology, and even tourism. There are very, very critical policy steps that has to be taken, sustainable policy steps, because we can no longer continue on that trajectory of dependency on the Federal Account Allocation Committee. And so you're right on that point that we have to look at fiscal restructuring of our economic process. But let's look at investments. I mean, this is a time for us to look at the importance of health, education, research, and the digital economy. Most of the experts and CEOs that we've had on the show have talked about the need for health, education to be given that priority it deserves in the country. What are your takes on critical sectors, critical investments on research, innovation, healthcare, and education at this time?
Right. So to begin with, and we said that long before COVID-19, we said that the scarce resources of the public sector should be focused on health and education. So we shouldn't be having subsidies for Agio-Kujo steel. We shouldn't be having subsidies for the refineries. We shouldn't be having a lot of other activities that drained resources off. The number one focus of the federal government, both levels of all 3 levels of government should be investing in Nigerian people, which primarily means health and education. But we all know that the way the limited budget resources were allocated doesn't necessarily focus on that. So now we've had COVID-19, and I think that that us and other professionals, as you say, are coming out and saying, look, it is obvious that we need to invest in education and technology and healthcare. But to take healthcare for a minute, that investment is going to take at least 2 forms. One, again, is to the extent that we have public sector resources, public health, primary health care needs to be delivered by the public sector, and we need to shift resources from where they are to that sector. I know there's a lot of efforts to strengthen the primary healthcare centers, for example, and LGAs. That has to be a focus. But at the same time, there's not sufficient public resources to build a healthcare system. So we need to have investment in private healthcare and building up private hospitals, private clinics, private radiology centers on that. But that's happening. I think people both inside Nigeria and outside Nigeria can see that there's a change of healthcare. We all understand healthcare tourism. I think $1 billion is normally cited as the amount that's drained out of it. So you were seeing, and even though the economy was not very good, 2017, 2018, 2019, you were actually seeing quite a lot of investment in private healthcare in Nigeria. And I think you'll see this accelerated. Obviously, a big part of it is tied together to the insurance, and there's been a lot of progress at the state level and having micro insurance programs for people. On education, and one of the most interesting things about education is people may not realize that, in fact, in primary education, most education is delivered by the private sector already, right? So in Lagos, 85% of school children go to private schools. The country, we would have no education system if we did not have private schools. There is not enough resources or organization for the public sector to deliver that. But again, I mean, one of the things that we've said is people always talk about oil, but actually the largest export of Nigeria is the diaspora. And so the way we phrase it,
the World Bank has said that this year we'll see like a 20% cut in diaspora remittances.
Right, but remember that cut is less than the cut in oil. The only I mean, yes. if you think of all the foreign exchange sources, so the diaspora, non-oil exports, which are small, oil exports, foreign direct investment, foreign portfolio investment, all of them are collapsing, except the diaspora is collapsing less than the rest. So it's the only thing really in effect holding up the economy. But what we've been saying is, look, we need to I mean, what's our biggest strength in Nigeria is people, right? And there's nothing wrong with having a strong diaspora that sends money, but even maybe more importantly is we'd like to see companies built that can export without people leaving Nigeria. So an example of that is the incredible company Outsource Global with Amal Hassan from well, I think born in Kano, but the company's Kaduna and Abuja, has 1,000 seats of educated northern Nigerians who are effectively exporting their brains to multinational companies, being paid in foreign exchange on that. And we need to do more of that. So we then need, how do you produce people that can, where we export Nigerian brains, we need to focus on the education system. So again, the scarce resources of the federal and state and local LGAs needs to go into education. And one particular thing that's a crisis right now, I think, is the tertiary education system. And of course, we've seen over the last few decades, places like Babcock, Covenant, Lagos Business School start to try to fill in the gap. And the issue at the tertiary education systems is simply they don't have the money. The tuition fees aren't high enough. The salary, the faculty really struggles under that. So we need more money. But I think if we, that investment comes in into some form of private education, not necessarily for profit, but private education, and people will pay for that. But the net result will be, Nigerians either through becoming part of the diaspora or through exporting while still in Nigeria will be giving a good payback to the country. So we would like to see education and healthcare right at the top of the agenda, and those are the fiscal priorities for us.
All right, Doctor, let's take a short clip of your recent presentation before the COVID-19 pandemic came on board and really disrupted global and economic activities in Nigeria. You were the keynote speaker at the EcoBank Agro Summit, Maiden Agro Summit in Lagos. Just want to take a short clip of some things you said about the Nigerian economy.
Relate this to population growth, maybe 2.5%. So if we're growing in a country 6%, it means people are getting 4% richer per year. Now, of course, we can argue about GDP and income distribution, but at a starting point, GDP is the number. Now, but what's going on in Nigeria? So this is 2018, 2019, 2020. Our growth rate was 1.9% in 2018, maybe 2.1 when they come out with the official numbers here. And how fast is our population growing? I thought it was growing 2.7%. I was with the acting chairman of the National Population Commission, and she said in public that the population is growing at 3.2%. Now, if the population is growing at 3.2% and we grow at 2.1%, what does it mean? Per capita, Nigeria is getting poorer and poorer and poorer. And those of you who've heard me speak before have heard me say we got poor in 2015 in Nigeria, 2016, 2017, 2018, 2019, and probably at least in 2020. So it's an urgent matter for Nigeria economy to grow faster. We've said for the last few years to make a difference to poverty, to bring 100 million people out of poverty, to alleviate unemployment among the youth, we need to grow at least 6 to 8%. And right now, we are not growing fast enough.
All right, Dr. Nevin, at that summit, you re-emphasized something you've been saying over the time, that Nigeria needs to grow faster, 6 to 8% a year. And of course, the International Monetary Fund's projection for even 2021 is that we will grow around 3%. a bit over 3%. Now, let's look at second half of the year. You, of course, agree with the president in his vision and plan to lift 100 million people from poverty between now and 2030. That is going to be a very big task for us. So looking at strategy, economic plan, and sectors that can really drive and achieve this, lifting people from poverty, growing at that level of 6% to 8%, what we'll be saying are the key steps that should be taken from the second half of the year and moving forward.
Yeah, so I think we've been very consistent. I mean, we've been saying 6 to 8% for a number of years and putting the message out. And of course, we haven't achieved it, so it's getting more and more difficult. CBN governor came out and actually at one point said we should be able to grow double digit, which I think is entirely possible for a period. So then the fundamental question is, we have all these programs, we have ERGP, we have the ESP now to try to come out of the COVID situation. The economy has got worse and worse per capita. What's the fundamental reason why this is not working? And what we've said for 4 or 5 years is it's really very simple. At the end of the day, people are not investing enough in the Nigerian economy. So just to put some numbers on it, if we want to grow at 6 to 8%, we need people to invest approximately 26 to 30% of GDP in what economists call gross capital formation. That's just the term for it. But the country's only getting about 16, 17, 18%. So only about 60% of the investment it needs. So the question that should be asked is, why are people not investing in Nigeria? If you look around the world, Europe, for example, the population is shrinking. People have negative interest rates on their bonds in Europe. So people, and yet people are buying those bonds. So rather than invest in Nigeria, they choose to buy negative interest rate bond in Europe. Unless we can answer that question, it's not just, of course, foreigners. It's the Nigerians investing in Nigeria, the diaspora investing in Nigeria, and then maybe the foreigners investing. Because no one's going to invest if Nigerians don't invest themselves. And I think that what we've said for the past 2 years is, while the federal government certainly has the right things in the strategy, as we talked about agricultural power, for example, digital, what they haven't managed to do is create the environment that people want to invest. So we've had PEBEC, and I think that Dr. Jamoke at PEBEC is a national heroine, and her team is fantastic. It is just remarkable what they've done. But what the federal government has refused to do is to really make any structural changes. So you've had PEBEC, so PEBEC talks about the single window. So you have a single window, but then you have to deal with, it was a one presentation, I may not get it right, but 29 MDAs as a corporation. So if you're dealing with 29 MDAs, the complexity and the cost of this is so high that at the end of the day, people choose not to invest in Nigeria. So we've got our neighbors in Ghana doing very well. Ghanaians are investing, the diaspora is investing, outsiders are investing, and yet in Nigeria, that's not happening. So unless there is a kind of simplification and a real move to kind of a restructuring that makes it easier to invest and more attractive to invest in Nigeria, we're not going to get it. And I say that, you said I play a number of roles. I say this not just as an economist. I say this as partner of PwC that serves many clients trying to invest. And myself, I've been involved in some startups in Nigeria. It is simply not easy to invest in Nigeria. And we hear I know so many, for example, diaspora that have returned to this country. They wanted to build a business, and they've just found, building any business is hard, but enormous challenges there. So unless we get this investment rate up from 16 to 18% to 26 to 29 or 30%, we're going to grow at 2%. It's just a mathematical certainty. If we don't invest, we're not going to grow. And so unless we get that investment, there really is no path forward. So then earlier in the program, I talked about forced restructuring. As I said, I think we may, if there's going to be, I don't want to call this a silver lining. COVID-19 is a catastrophe for the world. But if this forced restructuring creates an environment in which people want to invest, particularly in more localized state levels, we may come out of it stronger, but we certainly need to take advantage of it. We certainly need to unlock this, your report says, this dead capital to do it. But without getting that investment rate up, we're going to continue to have this GDP growth that's below the population growth. And that just means poor and poor and poor per capita. And it's been going on for at least 5 years. It's going to go on for at least two or three more. I don't want to say three, at least 2 years, the next 2 years. But the government has to get the structures right that people are prepared to invest in Nigeria.
Yeah, I mean, I hear you very well, Dr. Nevin. the League of Investment Experts, investment bankers, analysts, market stakeholders have also emphasized the need for gross capital formation to increase in the country to really address challenges in the economy. Well, let me take you on some very critical economic management models and approach. When you look at Nigeria at this time, as we begin to seek to reinvent ourselves, reinvent our economy, lift people out of poverty, millions out of poverty, achieve inclusive growth, what economic philosophy model works for us from your perspective? You've been here for years in the country, you've seen things. Some economists think we need to have a development state model. Others feel a social welfareism approach. Others feel a free market economy like we see in the US and the UK.
Well, I think that I go to conferences and I'll sometimes hear people, they'll talk about how fantastic Singapore has done, and that's South Korea is a model, or Finland's a model. And I'm saying it's just really unhelpful for our situation. For me, the best model for Nigeria to use in many cases is to look at what India's done. So India is a very big, messy democracy. We know if we live in Nigeria, we always say, Nigeria is complicated. That's our excuse. Nigeria is complicated. Well, the reality is India is complicated too. It's 7 times the population, big, messy democracy, cleavages along ethnicity, cleavages along religion, widely varied terrain, etc. And if you go back to the 70s and 80s, they had a very statist approach, and they had something that was called the Hindu rate of growth. So they were also in a situation where their growth rate was effectively below their population growth, and they were getting poorer and poorer through the 70s and 80s. What happened was in the early 90s, they had a crisis. Again, maybe a crisis is an opportunity, and they actually had to airlift their gold to Geneva to get a loan from the IMF. And they then said, look, there are things that we had been doing in terms of subsidies or structures that we no longer had to, we could no longer afford to do it. And they effectively told the states, you need to get on with your own economic development. And then what you saw in India was an explosion. Every state developed its own economic strategy. Of course, a lot of the 90s, India did what Nigeria is starting to do, like the Malhassan and more of, which is outsourced to multinationals who are paying in dollars. And one of the reasons that was so effective for them is the same thing that applies to us, is they were not in a position to produce physical goods. They didn't have the power infrastructure. They didn't have the port, the transportation infrastructure. Very difficult for Nigeria to be competitive in producing physical goods. Where Nigeria is competitive is producing Nigerian brains, right? And those can be exported without going through the Apapa port, right? So in terms of philosophy, I think so many times I look at an industry and I look to India to find, how they've dealt with it. Agricultural supply chain. Outsourcing, digitization, identity management on that. So that would be my philosophy on that. And if you look at India, they've listed, we have the Chinese economic model, and I lived through that. I went to China in 1983 the first time. I lived in China for 10 years. I speak Chinese, but it's not the model that we want, right? It's a communist, one-party dictatorship, tremendous problems around, personal liberties. We see what's happening in Hong Kong today. We see what's happening in Xinjiang. It's not the model for Nigeria. But I look at India, as I said, a big, messy democracy, open society. Challenges, but they've also lifted 300 or 400 million people out of poverty over the last 3 or 4 decades, between the green revolution in food and then the kind of IT revolution starting in the 90s there. And that should be the model on that. Now, do you call it statist? Do you call it liberal? I would just call it it's a mixed model. It's always going to be a mixed model, but state sector, public sector focused on health and education of the citizens. Everything else will take care of itself. But the one thing that's very clear about the Indian model is the states have the responsibility to figure out their own strategies, and different states have different strategies.
Interesting. No wonder Gujarat, where the current Prime Minister Narendra Modi was working well, and that's how he's transited to be the head of government. But let's look at the monetary space. The monetary space now in terms of our foreign exchange management. Let's talk about, on one side, liberalizing it, on the other side, manage floating. What do you say to this?
Well, I think that I think in Nigeria that a lot of times people expect too much of the CBN, all right? And we talk about monetary policy. I mean, I think the best analogy is that the economy is like a race car, and the CBN governor is the race car driver. So obviously, you know, you're better off having a better driver, and we have a very good governor. But if you put our CBN governor in a 1920 race car, he's not going to be competitive in F1, right, today. If you put him in a 1950 race car, he's not going to be competitive. So the CBN, the ability for monetary policy to fix fundamental structural issues is not there. And I think that oftentimes we just want to paper over the fundamental issues with interest rate change or something to do with the exchange rates. And then, of course, we've also seen the CBN, and I remember Governor Sanusi saying this very clearly as he left office in 2013, I believe, he gave, or in 2013, so a few months before he left, he gave an interview to CNBC. We were all there live at the Banker Committee sort of strategic retreat, which was in Calabar. And he said, and I'm sure the current governor would say the same thing, that you know, why is it that the CBN got involved in these intervention programs? And this is not necessarily like agriculture at that time, 2013. And it isn't necessarily a role for the central banks. And the Governor Sanusi was very clear. He said, look, if we didn't do it, no one else was doing it. So in a sense, you've had that program continue where the CBNs felt there are other economic actors aren't doing what's required. So they've had to get more involved in CBN, Anchor Borrower Program, Creative Arts Intervention Fund, SME Intervention Fund, all of these things, because the other structural elements of the economy are not in place. So I guess our view over the years has been that in a way, you know, we need to be more honest in Nigeria that the CBN cannot compensate, say, with monetary or foreign exchange policy for fundamental issues, the structural issues. Now, in the present environment, the one thing, of course, has changed with the oil price drop is now, you know, how can the CBN control the exchange rate, even a managed exchange rate? Because controlling the exchange rate means having dollars. But if there's no dollars coming from oil, and we'll see where the price settles out this year, but certainly when Brent was at $25 or $30, you weren't going to get any dollar flow. Maybe at $40, you get a little bit of dollar flow, but it's not enough for the CBN to control the exchange rate. And the biggest source of foreign exchange, of course, is the diaspora. But the difference between the diaspora foreign exchange and the oil foreign exchange is this: the diaspora foreign exchange is in the hands of millions of Nigerians. You know, so it's not something that the CBN controls, right? It's not their dollars. Obviously, the dollars from the oil industry, NNPC, come to the CBN. It's their dollars, but they're going to have too few dollars. So, and again, it's another example of this forced restructuring. I mean, the CBN and the federal government, the Minister of Finance, has already come out and said, you know, exchange rates are unifying. We've had the devaluation. There was effectively no choice.
And in just 1 minute, what are your closing thoughts this period as we reflect on our nation and economy?
Well, you know, I just want everyone to say a prayer today for all the victims of COVID-19. It's a horrible thing that's happened to the world and to Nigeria. I want everyone to stay safe. We're not nearly at the end of this situation. And in an economic sense, I think people need to really stand back. And you know, we've discussed the solutions. We've discussed them many times. There's no other path forward for Nigeria that we see except, you know, each state taking responsibility, and they all have tremendous competitive advantages, resources, people to do that. But the current structure is just not working. So as calamitous as COVID-19 is, please, can Nigeria take advantage of this to restructure in a way that we can start to achieve, you know, lifting 100 million people out of poverty, alleviating unemployment, and Nigeria to take its rightful place among nations in the world. So, and God bless Nigeria.
Thank you very much, Dr. Andrew Nevin, for your belief in Nigeria. You've been here and you continue to support economic planning, digital economy, and other areas in investment, and of course, what you do with WaterHouse Coopers. Dr. Andrew Nevin, Chief Economist, WaterHouse Coopers in West Africa, has been a guest on the Economic and Politics Show discussing the revised International Monetary Fund projections for the global and Nigeria's growth 2020 and beyond. Thank you very much for your insightful contributions and the need for us to fiscally restructure our economy, on the need for us to unlock debt capital to address liquidity issues, on the need for us to really take seriously governance and deepen our economic models for the good of the populace. Thank you once again.
Thank you.
That'll be all for the Economy and Politics show. You can join our website.
www.PwC.com to watch our videos with our news reports and analysis. 10 a.m. We'll continue this conversation on the market review. Till we come your way again, thank you for watching. Have a nice time and stay safe.